so much classified data, highly classified data, TSSCI data, SAPs, you name it. You know, there's no way, just no way that a lot of that data or any of that data probably is going to come out. So it may be, you know, pretty startling to the public how much data in fact does come out that most people don't know about. But in terms of some unbelievable reveal of the deepest, darkest deep state secrets, you know, there's not a snowball's chance in hell.
Introduce the panelists that we have aboard, and this is a panel on kind of like the hot topics that we've got that are going on right now in the world, and there's quite a lot of this. So I'd like to introduce the people on the panel. We have Dr. Kevin Knuth. He's a professor, an associate professor in the Department of Physics at University of Albany, SUNY, and is editor-in-chief of the journal Entropy, MDPI. Kevin is a contributing member of SCU and a vice president of science and technology for UAP expeditions. So we want to welcome Dr. Kevin Knuth on the panel. We've also got Mr. Peter Reali. Peter has a BS and MSEE from the University of California, Berkeley. He had a long career in Silicon Valley as an electrical design engineer and manager of engineering projects. His specialty was in telecommunications and network and information technologies. He is also an SCU board officer. We've also got Dr. Matthew Szydagis. He received his BA, MS, and PhD degrees from the University of Chicago, then worked as a postdoctoral scholar at the University of California, Davis. He's now an associate professor at the University at Albany, SUNY, studying experimental particle astrophysics, in particular direct detection of dark matter, as well as general detector development for rare event searches. He is a contributing member of SCU and also a consultant to UAPX in the science and technology area. We've also got Mr. Robert Powell. He's got a BS in chemistry and a former college debater. By the way, he did that with Mick West recently and excelled at it. He has had 28 years experience in engineering management in the semiconductor industry and was extremely valuable in the MUFON years that I was with them. He was the director of research for them, and that's where I met him. Robert's an excellent guy to be working with. I'm just glad to have him on board as well. He is also an SCU board officer. So that's kind of like the introduction. And Hal, if you're there, that's great. I'll have all of you just pretty much on, on board, and we'll see if we can't get questions again from the audience to be able to chat with you about. So hang on one second as I make a switch over to see if we have any. Okay, so I have some questions here that are beginning to pop in that we'll take a look at. How do the physical observables match historic accounts beyond the recent ATIP observations and analysis? Do early UAPs, even back to the 1800s, match these, or are these being applied retroactively as criteria to assess what might have been a real UAP? How about we start off with Dr. Knuth?
I don't know a whole lot about older sightings, especially those in the 1800s. I do know of a few of them that took place with discs and wheel-like objects, either coming out of the ocean or going into the ocean. There's an interesting article that my grandfather had clipped and put in with the with a pile of newspapers about the moon landings that I got, and he had took this article from a magazine called National Fisherman in 1960. I have a copy of this article and I can provide it to you and maybe put it on the website, but it actually talks about an account where a disc came out of the water in the late 50s, I believe, next to a ship, hovered there for a few seconds and then took off and flew over several other ships. So it was seen by 5 different people on 5 different ships from several different countries. So you had multiple witnesses on different ships from different countries, so they clearly weren't communicating. And so it was an interesting case, and the article was about that case, but they did some background research and they published information about several UFO sightings going back as far as, I think, 1865 or 68, something like that. So way back to the 1860s. And in that case, we had very similar accounts of UFO coming out of the water, hovering next to the ship for a few minutes, and then taking off into the sky. So you have multimedia travel certainly is one of the features that that's been replicated and goes way back to the 1800s. I'm certain that isn't the Chinese or the Russians, and they're not drones. So we can rule those out.
Robert Powell, I know that you're doing the study on the characteristics study. Does that come into play here in terms of these physical observables, if you would, that have been seen throughout history?
Well, that's one of the things that we're looking at, and our project's still ongoing. So far, when we see any type of patterns, it's usually over a specific time, very short time period. By short, I mean in weeks to days, and within a given geographical area. So far, we haven't picked up anything that extends pattern-wise and shape-wise across a large period of time.
Hal, in your work, you were looking at with the DIRDs. I mean, you were looking at lift, you were looking at propulsion, you were looking at a lot of these different observables even back at that point. Did you happen to look back on any historical cases, I guess, in those papers, or are you aware of that?
No, actually, I don't think we did look back. It was mostly dealing with data from today, or recent times.
Okay. Okay, so I guess the next question is, how have UAPs been observed in addition to the accidental visual observations? Obviously, human and animal vision and infrared, along with radar, but have observations been taken by other means? And if so, what means? Sound? Well, older rock band members reported in his observation a change in pitch prior to a launch. If credible, what is the significance? Does anybody want to handle that? Guess not. We'll move on to the next question.
A change in pitch, given my particular modeling about engineering the space-time metric, I would certainly consider that would be a reasonable thing to expect. And of course, like the Socorro sighting of Lonnie Zamora had sound associated with it, and then it went quiet. So it's an issue that's certainly worth following up on, but I don't know of any really collection of hard data.
Sure. What, if anything, do we know about the occupants of these craft? Have you ever tried to communicate with them using telepathy, any kind of means of doing that? This comes from Albert Vincenzo. Okay. I guess, are you aware of any studies or something like that done where attempts are being made to use other kinds of means to contact them, or any kind of contact? Has there been any attempts from the standpoint of science to contact objects or try to attempt to do that you're aware of?
I'm not aware of any.
Okay. There's a question here. Do you agree with Eric Davis and Jacques Vallée that objects or entities can alter perceptions and manifest as anything?
Well, I have the greatest respect, of course, for Eric, that we worked together for decades, and same with Jacques Vallée. So in their paper on incommensurability, they made a whole graph of levels ranging from the purely, you might say, physical, and then all the way up into interdimensional and aspects that would fall even into a category of spiritual and so on. So I think the issues they raise are well worth thinking about, and that model does come from data. I mean, Jacques has been sort of the leader since, I don't know, 50s at least, on collecting all levels of data, and has many examples of particularly a number of French cases, for example, where there's been more than just a physical interaction. And so for that reason, and because of my respect for Jacques and also for Eric and examining this area with him, I wouldn't rule it out. And I think that when people collect data, they should go out of their way. In fact, this is what Jacques often does. He'll get a physical description or whatever, and then that's sort of the end of the story, because people don't want to go the next step because they feel that their information will be discounted if they say, oh, by the way, the alien talked to me or whatever. And so he's always careful to push beyond the boundary of what's been reported and say, well, did anything unusual occur and so on. So I think in any investigation of particular cases, we should really go out of our way to press forward to gather any additional side data that to the average person would seem to be so far out he would discount his own story. Now, I personally, when I was developing my space-time metric model, what appealed to me the most were things that sounded the weirdest, because I figured that if somebody said, pretty straightforward stuff and they know their story to be taken, well, maybe they're making it up, maybe not. But when somebody says, the craft was only 30 feet across, when I got inside, it was as big as a football field. Well, that's the kind of thing that if you're making something up that sounds so ridiculous, you would never reveal that. So if somebody reveals something that goes off into these unusual areas, in my mind, it's actually more likely to be true. So at least should be taken seriously. So anyway, I recommend that we don't discount that kind of data, even though we're not yet in a position to verify it.
Thank you, Hal. Has anyone heard anything about any technology that may be inadvertently used as bait to basically create UAP appearances to happen, and then we could utilize either civilian or military tech to be able to video them, record them, anything we wanted to do?
There were some situations in Russia in their reporting where they decided to go out of their way to have some kind of mass mobilization at some location with really high-tech equipment, and that seemed to draw in UAP. So that's the one example that I've heard of that I thought was very credible.
What, if anything, do you believe, any of you, I'd like to get your opinion, is going to come out of the UAP task force? What do we expect? And let's just get a conversation going on that. Hal, what do you, we'll start with you. Well,
in general, in this subject area, there's so much classified data, highly classified data, TSSCI data, SAPs, you name it. There's no way, just no way that a lot of that data or any of that data probably is going to come out. So it may be, pretty startling to the public how much data in fact does come out that most people don't know about. But in terms of some unbelievable reveal of the deepest, darkest deep state secrets, there's not a snowball's chance in hell.
Robert, you want to comment on it?
Yeah, I mean, I guess to me, on the New York Times leak, right, where they said that the only thing the government knows for sure is that it wasn't ours. So that leaves the Russians, the Chinese, and the unknown intelligence. I can't believe, because they said there were 120 of these cases. I can't believe that in 20 years, with 120 cases, we can't figure out if it was the Chinese or the Russians with all of our advanced radar capabilities and satellites, that we have no idea if it was them. I think we could eliminate those two guys if we looked at it carefully.
And as it turns out, one of the issues that Lou Elizondo just made in a recent Tucker Carlson event was that the report of a Tic Tac back in the 50s that had the same characteristics as what's being reported now, that pretty much rules out, because if they were that far ahead of us that many decades ago, we'd see a lot more evidence of it. So, when we see it now, you can say, okay, well, countries can have some pretty sparkly technology in the background or whatever. But when you say, okay, well, did the Chinese have something like that, or the Russians have something like that 70 years ago? Not really. So that's kind of an argument against superficial interpretations.
Dr. Szydagis, what do you think? Matt, come on. I want to hear what your young perspective is.
Yeah, I don't have gray hair yet. Yeah,
I do.
I think that, I echo a lot of the sentiments that have been said, is that even though it's going to be extremely disappointing to many, the thing is that even if we had evidence that we were dealing with a non-human intelligence, I think that people would not be, the government would consider people not ready for that. We just look around at humanity today. We can't even, we still hate each other, right? You just look at what's happened recently. We have Israel and Hamas going at it again. We had George Floyd and BLM and everything. We can't even treat members of the same human race as equals. Imagine what would happen if it were revealed that we have evidence, even if it was just preliminary or tentative or speculative, by process of elimination, like it's not Russian, it's not Chinese, not ours. So what's left, right? So even if by process of elimination it's pointing towards some sort of non-human intelligence, then no one's going to come out and say that, because we can't even, as I said, we can't even treat fellow human beings with equality and respect. Imagine the reaction that would happen if it was publicly admitted that we had evidence of non-human races and intelligence. You just look at fiction, which fiction mirrors reality. You look at Carl Sagan's Contact, and the terrorists who took out the ship, and then Jodie Foster had to replace the original astronaut because the terrorists blew up the ship because they didn't want us to contact the aliens. And I think that if we're racist against each other, imagine how racist we would be against a non-human race. So I'm not at all surprised that everything has to be couched in very careful terms, like in the New York Times and Congressional Report. I'm not in the least bit surprised.
Peter, what are your thoughts? Peter, you're on mute, by the way. You have to unmute.
trying to be a good citizen here. You know, and I agree with Matthew very much. I think, in fact, if people really realized right now the idea of aliens and and first thing, I don't think we're dealing with one entity or one race. I think, and I'll be talking about that later, that there are a multitude of, if you just look at the different vehicle reports, they're all many radically different designs and concepts and strange things. I don't think there's just one thing going on. But if people really knew that there was, you know, advanced entities that were a million years ahead of us and knew it for a fact, right now it's just sort of a vague concept. It would destabilize our society quite a bit. I mean, you just look at what wearing masks did in the United States. I mean, people are, you know, not very, they don't handle, at least certain segments of the population don't handle uncertainty very well. And, you know, so I think that, you know, from that perspective, there's probably, I think back in Project Blue Book, one of the reports, they went to the Patel Institute, and it was recommended that this not be brought out to the general public, our inability to, you know, deal with these things or be able to counteract them. You know, the government's authority is that they can control things, you know, take that away, and then who's in charge? And so I think that that's behind some of this inability to release things. I think it's getting now so that because of the, well, cell phones and the wide availability of technology, you can't just sit on this anymore. It's coming out, people are seeing it. So, you know, that's kind of my opinion.
Dr. Knuth, Kevin, what do you think?
I was just now thinking back about when we teach freshman physics. And one of the important features of freshman physics class is having a laboratory component. And the purpose of the laboratory component is really to get the students to experience the phenomena themselves and come to understand it themselves, so they can see it in action and then come to understand what we're teaching them. So see it through their, you know, so that they realize it rather than just being told, right? And I think, and I suspect that this is what's going to happen with humanity. And I suspect that we might see some of this with the, you know, with disclosure, that it will probably come slowly, and they'll basically slowly whittle away at the hypotheses until there's really only one left. And that's what we've seen already. And in doing so, you're basically allowing the, you know, allowing people to come to that conclusion themselves. Well, yeah, it can't really be the Russians because of this and this and this, and then they put it together, and then it's much more entrenched that this is a reality than just another crazy thing that somebody in the government happened to say. And so I suspect that we're not going to get a statement that, yes, it's aliens, yes, we have crash craft, yes, we, you know, here's what they look like, here's pictures, you can meet one, or you have some in a zoo, or God knows what anybody might come up with. But I think instead it's going to be more like, well, yeah, this has been going on a very long time, and, you know, clearly isn't the Russians, or it isn't the Chinese, because they have their own UAP task force right now, right? We just learned about that in the last day or two as well. So I think that while this report to some people might be a bit disappointing, I think that it really does have to happen this way. You know, we've been slowly primed for this, you know, through entertainment, but seeing science fiction stories is a very different thing than having it be a reality. So I think it's going to still take some time, but it's happening.
I agree. Thank you. This goes out to any or all the panelists. We've seen very little publicity in the way of satellite imagery or sensor data from U.S. intelligence and NatSec communities, or even civilian aerospace organizations. I'm wondering why that is, given that it would be particularly compelling as UAP data. Is it simply that the tech specs of these satellites are too sensitive from a national security standpoint? Or is it because, obviously that this is part of that data that Hal's talking about? It's going to be in the classified section of the document. So, I mean, anybody want to handle that one? Okay, Kevin?
Yeah, I can speak from some experience because we at UAPX have been trying to get satellite coverage for some of our operations and trying to collect data, and it's extremely difficult. Of course, there still is it's not exactly a giggle factor, but it's more of a runaway factor. You mentioned UAPs or UFOs to these people at a satellite company, and the next thing you know, they're busy on another project, a more important project. So that's an issue that we've come across. The other problem is coverage. There is a lot of satellite coverage, but it's not continuous still. There's a lot of talk about more satellites going up. A lot of companies are talking about how great their coverage is. A lot of this is talk. It's not yet reality. So when you have a UFO sighting or something that happened in 2018 and it happened at noon, and you go back and you find you can get a picture at 9 a.m. On that date, but not in that location, but not at noon. So there's still some difficulty there. I can't speak to anything on the military or government side, though.
I know that Chris Mellon has been talking to people at NORAD, and his first question, of course, is, "Do you have uncorrelated targets?" And of course, the answer was, "Well, yes." Okay, is there any chance we can get hold of them? Well, we'll look into it. So at least he's attempting to negotiate to get access, at least to the due system and whatever. I don't know about satellite data.
If I can add, Rich, jump in here, is I had an idea I had suggested to Kevin, which is, so first there's Kevin and Felipe Alaris's original idea, which I think is brilliant, of multimodality, where in the sense that you look at a historical, not just present and future reports, you look at past reports, a disk hovered here for 20 minutes, we'll check the satellite, because then that eliminates, people are crazy, it's a mass delusion. Really, is the satellite deluded when it sees an unknown spot there at the exact moment someone's claiming they saw a UFO from the ground? That's one aspect. And I was thinking of this from another perspective I'd suggested to Kevin is, what if you ask for a whole bunch of satellite photos from days and times of encounters that just happen to have satellite data at the same time? If it turns out they're all classified, that in itself, it's kind of like guilty through, like when you plead the Fifth Amendment or something like that. To me would be amazing. I would want to do a study where you ask for random days and times of satellite photos and then compare that to asking for days and times of encounters. And in one case, if it's random, whether that day and time is classified, and the other time it's classified, don't have it, classified, that would be highly suspicious to me. It doesn't prove anything. It doesn't prove it's aliens or non-human, but it proves it's interesting, and it proves it wasn't imagined and it wasn't made up.
Anybody else? If not, we'll move to the next question.
Well,
go ahead,
I think that I think one of the big problems, and I think is kind of alluded to, is that most of these like private satellite companies, you might be able to get access to it, but they're in to make money. I mean, they have to survive, right? And so they're not probably have time there, to volunteer their satellite imagery and stuff on a general basis, and the coverage it was said that it's probably not 100%, you know, and the people that probably really do have it is the military, but that's probably all classified because it's looking for ICBMs and cruise missiles and all kinds of other stuff, you know, and they wouldn't want to give away their technology. So I think that boils down to a huge effort. I mean, it's easy to say that, but, you know, unless there's money and time and, you know, actually money, you know, to basically hire, you know, these organizations to be able to do a serious study, I don't think it's going to happen. And I think for that to happen, this has to be taken seriously. And still, I think by and large, in spite of what we think, it's still considered a fringe kind of topic and not accepted in the general public yet.
Okay. The next question we got here is.
Oh, I have a quick thing I'd like to add, if I could.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Sorry. Yeah. So another point. And Peter just mentioned being classified because of technology. It's important to remember that that's not the only reason for classification. If you release one image from a satellite, you can, if somebody can figure out the time and angle from which that image was taken, you can figure out the orbital elements of the satellite, and that's an important information, you know, and so that's something you'd want to keep classified, because if you know the orbital elements of a spy satellite, then you know when it's going to be passing overhead. So you know to quick cover your missiles up with tarps because the thing's going to be flying over in 15 minutes, right? So there's many reasons to classify these things, not just because of technology.
So, okay, thank you. Question it comes up in terms of like what is the perceived disconnect that you have, and why do you think that this is between, you know, the announcements that you keep hearing from like Susan Gao, who is the PAO, and about, you know, well, good old Lou is not part of this, or and it seems like that there's such a disparity between what the Department of Defense releases and what we hear elsewhere. Anybody want to comment on that? Is that a tack to be able to throw us off guard? Is it anyway? That's just a question that keeps surfacing here. So,
well, it's just that Susan Goff and people in the public affairs office are infinitely removed from what's actually going on. So they can give a reasonable explanation or description of something if somebody comes and tells them who actually knows the answer. But by and large, they don't volunteer. So she has gone whiplash back and forth because she gets different inputs at different times from different people. So it's just that the public affairs office is the last place you can really expect to get good data.
okay. Let's see. Did the Tic Tac try to attack the Nimitz aircraft in 2004? It appears the UAP as hitting the Nimitz aircraft with an EMP pulse, which saturates the IR detector array. Did anybody aware of that type of thing? I know that there was electronic jamming that was believed to, but this said it appears that the UAP is hitting the Nimitz aircraft with an EMP pulse. Did anybody hear about that?
No, I mean,
go ahead, Robert.
I was just going to say, I mean, I've talked to Lieutenant Commander Slate, and we've, you know, investigated that case in detail, right? Because we have that 270-page report. There's no indication that there was any intentional, you know, EM attack of any type, you know, from the Tic Tac.
Yeah, and I was a co-author with Robert on that, and exactly there it seems to be that as time goes by, more and more stories come out about the thing keeps growing, you know, with added stories, and But we were studying this early, and there's no indication of that. I personally believe that the drive mechanism of the UAP affects radar, and that's why they thought it was being jammed. But if there's spatial anomalies around the device, then of course radar will be reflected poorly, and all kinds of things will happen. But that's just my opinion, anyhow. But I don't know of any. There's been no. In fact, it seemed to be I think it was said in there that they wanted at all costs to avoid us. They just seemed to be not want to be around us, and that, is what I got out of it.
Yeah, if there was an attempt at an attack, you can at least say that it was surprisingly ineffective. You can say that much. Now, you just said something interesting there, Peter, about the drive system possibly affecting the radar. And that reminded me that the shutting down of nuclear weapons might also be a byproduct of their propulsion mechanisms. If I remember right, Robert Salas, when he talked about the events that he was involved in, it was the missiles shut down because of a guidance and navigation failure. And so if you've got warping of space-time going around these objects, I wouldn't be surprised if the guidance and navigation systems on these missiles would be affected. And if they were affected and you had some type of safety mechanism to shut down the missile in case if these were infected, then you could understand that missiles could be shut down by accident.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that it'll affect electromagnetic effects because electromagnetism travels through space, and it'll be diverted. A lot of systems will stop operating properly. Time will be affected. As you get close to a warp in space, general relativity says that that's going to affect time, and a lot of our normal physical parameters that we depend on for operation of equipment. I remember in the old days, in the 50s, reported cars would have their engines would suddenly stop, and when they got near one of these things, and then the thing would leave and it would start up again. Things like that. I don't have the deep physics background to really understand it, but I can sort of schmooze around it, and I think that it seems like a sensible approach to understanding what's going on there. I think the UAPs may want to stay away from us because if we approach them, it may damage the airplanes, and they may be trying to protect us actually. So.
Kind of curious to know the answer to this question. What do you, you just talked about time. We keep dancing around space, time, and time. And Hal was talking about that in the context of like time in relationship to being inside of a craft and stuff like that. But what does the panel think about a theoretical possibility of backwards time travel? Anybody?
I think I'd like to take this one, since I have a TED talk on it, which I'm very proud to say has probably as much views as people much more famous than me. But yeah, this is one of my pet topics, even though I don't research it. I know people who do, like Ronald Mallet. I think from what I've looked into, I know we have Michael Masters here who will disagree. I know he's got his hypothesis that we're dealing with time travelers, but I think that it's very unlikely because we don't know. What we do know is that to time travel to the past would require some form of negative energy or exotic material, the same thing you'd need to hold a wormhole open. The problem is that it's not just that we don't know where to get such material. We don't even know if it exists other than tiny fractions of a second as virtual particles, as quantum fluctuations. And so I think there are a lot of obstacles, a lot of challenges to overcome in order to make time travel to the past, if that would be a reality. Now, in my opinion, But it's, again, opinion, not fact, just my opinion, far removed from this. I don't work on it myself. In my opinion, I think it would be much easier to envision signaling of the past. A kind of time telephone is a lot more realistic, in my opinion, than a occupant in a machine, you know, like H.G. Wells. I think that's a lot more difficult. I do think we need to keep an open mind, because scientists and engineers used to think air travel was a joke, that space travel was impossible, right? Kevin, who's right here, often quotes the famous astronomers 2 weeks before Sputnik saying that space travel was impossible. So I want to be cautiously optimistic, but with our current understanding of physics, it looks like it would be extremely, extremely difficult. I do want to be optimistic, because I would want nothing more than for time travel to be a reality. It's one of the crazy ideas that got me interested in becoming a physicist. But right now, it's just, there's so many levels of impossible you'd have to get through that I don't see how we or another civilization even could get there. But again, I don't want to be a Debbie Downer. I do want to be cautiously optimistic.
Rich Hoffman, can I interject here? This is Eric Davis.
Go ahead, Eric.
Yeah.
Matt, that was good, but most of what you said was technically incorrect. The solution for traversable wormholes that was published by Kip Thorne and co-authors back in 1988, 1989, and by Matt Visser for the next following 20 plus decades, or 2 plus decades, demonstrated the proof of principle from general relativity theory that backward time travel is possible. However, you're limited only in going backwards in time to the point at which you turn the time machine on. You can't go further back than that. Secondly, exotic matter is already created in the laboratory. It's called the Casimir vacuum energy. It's also called squeeze light states, which have alternating pulses of negative vacuum energy density. And we also have proof from Matt Visser's paper in early 1990s in Science magazine that he demonstrated that the present day values of the cosmological parameters can only be possible if there is exotic matter somewhere in the universe. And he presented a physics and mathematical proof of that. Exotic matter is basically called subvacuum fluctuations, or suppressed energy fluctuations, vacuum energy fluctuations due to boundary conditions on the vacuum. And that boundary condition can be the 2 parallel walls of a Casimir cavity, or they could be an externally applied electric or magnetic field of some sort, or a gravitational field that acts on a finite region of the quantum vacuum. And what that does is that external boundary condition can reshape the vacuum fluctuations so that they polarize, and the act of polarizing the vacuum fluctuations in a finite volume, you would find that it has negative vacuum energy. This is well known in quantum field theory, and it's been published in my peer-reviewed papers in my book, my AIAA book. And it's been published by Matt Visser. It's been published by Paul Davies, and I could go on and on. But that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Oh yeah, let me clarify. You're absolutely right, Eric. Especially so on your first point. Yeah, in my YouTube video about time travel, that's one of the first things I bring up, is that if time travel were possible, you cannot go back before the day you constructed the machine or the phenomenon. That disappoints a lot of people, because that means if, we're not going to visit the ancient Greeks or Romans unless we've already had a time machine. So you're absolutely right on that. And on your second point, you're also absolutely right. I think you may have misunderstood me. I'm aware of all the papers and your work as well that you cited. I just meant that, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I meant that we don't know a way of macroscopically generating kilograms or tons of exotic matter sufficient to build a time machine or warp drive yet. Yeah. So what I meant is we can't generate, we've got virtual particles. And in fact, I'm mentioning this in my talk on Sunday, second half of my talk, I'm going to talk about Casimir effect and Lamb shift and stuff like that. But I meant we don't know how to manufacture kilograms of this to create a time machine or an Alcubierre.
That I agree with you. Yeah, I agree with you on that. Absolutely. And a lot of the work I was doing up until I changed jobs in 2019 was on scaling up negative vacuum energy by looking at a different type of squeeze light. It's using Larry Ford's proposal in PhysRev-D, and it was focusing vacuum fluctuations using a parabolic cylindrical mirror along the focal line of the mirror, and whether that could be scaled up. And so Larry, my colleague Jordan McClay in Illinois, and we've been going back and forth off and on for years trying to figure out a scaling effect so that the magnitude of the negative energy on that focal line can be drastically increased. So yeah, I agree with you in that context. That's a key engineering challenge, not a physics issue anymore. So it's more of how do we engineer that. So very good point. I stand corrected on your comments. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I agree with you completely. Just a misunderstanding. Yeah, on my points. Yeah, you're totally correct. And I'm a great follower of your work, and I love this. I really hope that we can turn this into a successful technology. It's one of the reasons I'm a physicist, is this kind of stuff. Even if I'm not working on it directly myself right now, this is exactly the kind of stuff that got me interested in science.
Well, thank you very much. And I applaud your work in this. And I want to acknowledge my former boss, Hal Puthoff, of 15 years, for the opportunity that he gave me to be able to have the flexibility to go into and do deep dives on these type of physics problems and engineering problems relevant to not just helping the United States, either private industry or the government, develop faster than light propulsion technologies within wormholes or warp drive physics, but also in how this could possibly be used as an explanation for UAP propulsion through the use of general relativity and quantum field theory approaches. And Hal and I go way back to our first introduction at NIDS in July 1996. So he was part of the reason why Bob Bigelow hired me, because it was John Alexander who found my CV in a large, tall stack of CVs applying for the job that I got. Was the director for aerospace and astrophysics research at NIDS. And Hal was given my CV to review, and I think he found some commonalities between the two of us in our professional background and interest. So out of that big stack of CVs, I ended up getting hired, and from that point on, Hal and I became best of friends and collaborators and colleagues. And after I lost my job at NIDS, I went to work for AFRL at Edwards Air Force Base as a contractor. And that ran out after several years, and Hal picked me up and hired me. So Hal has been instrumental in pushing my career forward and helping me become successful, or giving me the opportunity to become successful in both professional physics and in UAP research and investigations. And that's when I became a professional UAP physicist, was back when I started my job at NIDS. So thank you, Hal.
The one comment I'd like to make is that I'm glad they can't do this because of the paradoxes that would be involved. If you could go back into the past and change things, it would seem to me you'd either have to go into a parallel universe or it would screw everything up. So I'm glad it can't happen.
That's a very good question. And the grandfather paradox was already solved back in the 2000s by Jean. Oh my gosh, I forgot his first name. It's hyphenated. He's French. His last name is Bruneton. Jean-Pierre, maybe. And he's a mathematical physicist who did a study on all this. And he basically showed that the type of time loops through space, or the path through space in a time machine that you would take, it's called a closed time-like curve, that you would take to go into the past, where you could go back and kill your grandfather to prevent yourself from being born. Those are not even physically allowed. And I'm not going to get into a whole exposition on the mathematical and physics reasons behind that. It's just that is not an allowable motion. What is an allowable motion is to turn on your time machine, go into the future, come back, and that would be done by traversable wormhole or a warp drive, and even other solutions from general relativity that have nothing to do with faster than light motion. Where you can go back into the past to the point at which the time machine is turned on, and you just can wave goodbye to yourself or hello to yourself as you see yourself your earlier self departing for your time travel. So that's it. You really can't influence your past in that method. That is an allowable mathematical solution for time travel. And that was cited in my 2000, Jeepers, I'm trying to remember, my 2016 paper in the Journal of the British Interplanetary Society. And I believe I also covered that in chapter 15 of my AIAA book with Mark Millis, titled Frontiers of Propulsion Science.
Right.
I'm glad that's
Yeah, all this is heavily mathematical, man. I mean, it's heavy duty physics and heavy duty math, and there's not a lot of people that are going to want to listen to all that. So, and plus you have a finite agenda time here, so I don't want to take up all of that on this particular discussion.
All right. Well, I think we killed the time thing. Let's move on. So while we got time, anyway, is there anything that we individuals can do that would help further research of the UAP? Anybody want to tackle that?
Well, I think we're trying to do it. I mean, you know, the SCU, we're trying to make it respectable, applying science to it, you know, objective evidence, rather than just subjective things. And these may all be real. All these subjective things may be real, but nobody can do anything with it. And so, you know, that I think that's my perspective.
Some good papers have been generated by SCU. Have any of them been submitted to be published in regular peer-reviewed physics literature?
Sorry, I was momentarily detained. Dr. Puthoff, in your paper, you were saying that the physical effects of an altered space-time by a typical stellar mass, natural, are opposite those of an advanced technology craft. Care to comment?
I didn't quite get what the question. What was the question?
It says in your paper, you were saying that the physical effects of an altered space-time by a typical stellar mass, natural, are opposite those of an advanced technology craft.
Well, GR is usually applied to typical astrophysical situations. And so in my paper, I have two giant tables. One is just sort of the standard stuff you run into in any GR course. And then, so that talks about the effects of stellar masses and gravity wells and all the usual stuff, which includes, you know, time slowing down as you approach a black hole or whatever. And then separately, just saying, well, suppose I take the opposite case. And then it was a series of opposite entries that all seem to line up with what's claimed in UAP observation. So that's why I thought GR was a critical key.
Any comments on the July 2019 SoCal Navy events? Recently, I discovered there may be a correlation to SM-2 missile test launches from the ships and appearance of the unknown on the night. That's the USS Kidd, Omaha, Finn, and Russell. Has anybody looked into that? Guess not. What about weather radar? Does anybody know if weather radar could be used in the context of looking for these things?
The main problem with weather radar is most of the time the radar only sweeps once every 5 minutes and once every 10 minutes. So it's, you know, the likelihood of you catching anything, and if you do, you only have one data point. And it's always difficult to do anything with one data point.
Okay. Let's see. The miraculous arrival of a...
You do have the interesting case of the Chicago O'Hare. It wasn't exactly a weather radar, but where the UFO supposedly was seen hovering over one of the gates, and then it took off up through a cloud cover and left a hole. So the possibility that if cloud conditions are such and a UAP observation is in the vicinity, you might see some correlated elements there.
The miraculous arrival of a Tic Tac at a cap point is perhaps the most serious aspect of the report, and the Nimitz incident. You know, it's like, how did it do that? I mean, does anybody want to comment on that aspect of it?
I'd like to comment on it because I think that what is not brought out much, and it was in our paper, is that there were multiple Tic Tacs moving up and down from 80,000 down to 28,000 feet. He was saying like sometimes more 10, 12. It was like rain. And I think Tic Tacs all look pretty much the same. So we don't even know it was the same one. So that's unverified. They just saw another Tic Tac there. So it may have been the same one, may not have been the same one. I just want to point that out. In our paper, we analyzed the case where it was the same one or not the same one, and still looked at the acceleration of what Fravor saw, and for it to go out of visual observation, which doesn't require it to be the same one, and the accelerations were enormous. So I just wanted to point that out.
I'll make a quick comment. Rocky Swanson in the chat room made a comment, and I know Rocky, he's worked in the Canadian Air Force, so he should have a feel for this. It's something we weren't aware of, I think, when we wrote the report on the caps, and he's indicating that those cap points will remain the same cap point for up to a week to 2 weeks. So based on that, anything that was observing the carrier strike force could intelligently figure out where the cap point might be, which still indicates intelligence figuring something out and perhaps sending you a signal by saying, hey, I figured this out.
Approximately in 1997, the NORAD facility was put into lockdown, apparently in response to the detection of an absolutely enormous object detected off the West Coast, miles in diameter, not feet in diameter. I was told to file a FOIA request when I inquired with the DoD Public Affairs Office. I'm wondering if anyone on the panel knows of this or has anything on that. Anybody aware of that 1997 incident? Okay. Is LIGO, another potential applicable corroborative data source for the UAP detection, even if it's not perfect for the purpose?
Well, it measures gravitational distortions, but I think you'd have a hard time co-opting that instrument to measure UAP stuff. I mean, I think it's probably used for other, for their scientific experiments, but.
Yeah, I'm not on LIGO, but
lucky that UAP decided to drop in and close encounter and make a big signal. That would be great.
Yeah, and you shouldn't have to co-opt the equipment. The data's made public, so there's a data record. So what you would really need to do is to identify prominent UAP sightings near that site in Louisiana or the other location, and then just look at the data, and you could simply correlate, run a correlation between UFO occurrences in the area and the data, and probably be able to show something.
I'm not on LIGO, but I know people who are. So I can add something. So I'm not on LIGO, but I know people who are, and I think that it's good that, like Kevin, you said, if the data is public, but I don't know if all the data is public or has been filtered for noise already, because one of the things I would worry about is what would seem uninteresting and they might think was a truck rumbling down the highway and was noise might have actually been an interesting signal. It's because there's so much overwhelming data and you have to get the needle from the haystack. I think that anyone, on LIGO, if approached about this, would think we're all insane and not want to talk about it at all. Although maybe that is changing, as Hal said, the stigma is decreasing. But I would be very interested in that, because I wonder in the data how many signals are thrown out as like, oh, that doesn't match two black holes colliding. But the other thing is, I worry about the strength of the signal, as Hal was saying, being close by, because we need to remember, even when we're talking about gravity and space-time engineering, things like that, one of the challenges about gravity is it's the weakest force in nature. It doesn't seem that way. But remember, a magnet, beats the entire planet Earth, right? So one of the mysteries of physics, why is gravity like 40 orders of magnitude weaker than the weak force even, and much weaker than electromagnetism, things like that? So the reason why we detect gravitational waves is because they're colossal events, right? Singularities colliding. If you've got something that's generating enough gravitational waves to be detected by LIGO, that's pretty scary. And that goes back into also, Hal listed, ill effects from UAPs and stuff like that. If you're close enough to have measurable gravitational waves, that could be a serious problem.
And I think,
if these things were generating huge gravitational disturbances, you didn't know about it. I mean, it would be disturbing everything. Every time a UFO went over, it would be a real problem, and we don't hear that. So I think when they get close, there's disturbances, but I don't think it'd be very likely.
well, that comes down to a near field, far field difference again, which is what you get in electromagnetism as well. But I know that there are groups looking for events that are basically unknown events in LIGO data. So they're looking for things that are not caused by two black holes or neutron stars spinning in and colliding. So I believe that data is probably all pretty much available. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to discover other things, right? So
that might be a good research. Topic in the future if you can get a hold of that stuff. I would, probably not easy to do, but I think we've opened up a new avenue for.
It's easy to do. I mean, the NASA Space Telescope data is all publicly available. There's portals. I mean, your tax dollars pay for this, and they're required by law to make it publicly available. So I think this probably isn't a problem.
According to the New York Times, the UFO disclosure will state that there is no evidence of spacecrafts with ET visitors. If true, do you think that they're lying? I mean, we keep hearing that there's no evidence that ET is here, but yet at the same time, we hear about crashes. We hear about all different other kinds of evidence, if you would, that supports the fact that there's something rather unusual. We keep going around and dancing around and skirting around the fact that no technology on the planet exists to be able to do this, but we don't want to go out and make the statement that it's possibly elsewhere. I know that we're looking for strong evidence, but I mean, do you believe that there's no evidence at all? Anybody care to comment?
Well, I'll comment. We wouldn't be here if we didn't think there was evidence. At SU, I think there's lots of evidence, but people have to look at it. And I think a lot of scientists, again, we talked about that their careers are at stake if they say that this stuff is valid. It's still considered fringe, and it's kind of dangerous for them. So they play it safe and say there's no real evidence yet. Yet they'll go all, astronomers now are going to go look for techno signatures on other stars and stuff, planets and things. What's that all about? I mean, if there can be technologies that advanced, way ahead of us, they probably have been here already, so, I just think it's playing it safe.
Yeah, I'll comment on that, Richard. In terms of, what you have to start off doing is eliminating things, right? It's not the Russians, it's not the Chinese, it's not our programs. So you begin eliminating. I mean, you can't prove at this point in time that, they came from Tau Epsilon, unless we had a radar track leading back to Tau Epsilon, or unless they landed and said, we're from Tau Epsilon. But you basically have to put together your hypothesis and then run tests to try to argue for that hypothesis. And it's really a continuum of, what's the likelihood? And you just kind of like Matthew's dark energy and dark matter, which, I'm not completely a fan of, but you have to argue towards that continuum. And you can't, there's not a black and white answer at this point in time.
I think it's rather interesting to find that, like you brought up before, that, we don't know anything after 120 cases or something like that. Well, let's take a look at the fact that we've been at this for a long time with UFO history. And I'm sure that there are some scientists that have been over the course of the 70 plus years around looking into this. Why is it that science can't broach this subject and come up with anything at all after 70 plus years? Is it the stigma? Is it the fact that we can't get scientists to engage this topic? What are your thoughts? I mean, why is it that and then what do we assume for the next 70 years? We're going to be sitting here talking like this and still with no answers. So how do we get past that stigma issue that you just raised in terms of the fact that we can't get scientists like you all that will engage this topic? Thoughts?
I mean, what we've been told for my whole life that this is nonsense. This is nonsense and silly tinfoil hat stuff, a bunch of nutters, drunk people wandering out of bars and seeing lights in the sky at 2 a.m. This is what I've been told my whole life. So and other scientists, I've been told this from the government. I've been told this by my science teachers, by my colleagues. And that does a lot to hamper anybody's desire to even talk about this. Just talking about this can, raises eyebrows and makes other scientists start to doubt your whether you have it together or not. So I think that's part of the biggest problem. And that's all. This didn't need to be. Nobody needed to cover this up. All you have to do is sow enough doubt that the extreme skeptics, or extreme debunkers just are loud enough that everybody else is quiet. That's all you need to do. So I think that's been the problem. Now what's happened more recently, with the Navy coming out and saying, look, we have a real issue here. That's given some of us, I think it's the 162 of us who are here, that the courage to say, well, wait, this is actually interesting. Let's look at this and see what we can do. This should be studied. So I think things are changing now that you've got scientists looking at it. I mean, some of us are collecting data. Some of us have actually recorded data on these things. And so now that's going to change. Once we start publishing papers, that's going to change. Young scientists especially, are hungry for any new problem they can get into. And many are actually desperate to find new problems to work on. So once it's clear to the scientific community that there's something here to look at, it's going to be a gold rush of scientists trying to study this. But you first have to get to that point where it's very clear that there's something interesting here and that it's doable. Once people know that studies like this can be done, that you're going to learn something, you can make a name for yourself, you're going to see it happen. In one way, if Congress actually wants a scientific solution to this, one thing that they could do is they could appropriate funds, for scientific grants. They could do that through any of the funding mechanisms, NSF, NASA, DOE, whatever they choose to. But having funding available for scientists to study this would make a huge difference. Money always makes a difference, of course, right? and
I
that
think
makes
Kevin
your
makes a
administrators be happy. You know, your administrators are then happy that you're studying it, and that's really a big deal.
Yeah, Kevin
I
makes
know
a
that-
good point. I mean, you have to have data to bring in the scientific community. And that's why if you look at what we've looked at SCU, we've looked at the cases that had the most data. The Nimitz case, the Aguadilla case, or the Stephenville case. The problem is we need that data, right? And take the recent New York Times article where they indicate the government has 120 cases that are basically military cases over the last 20 years. So, you know, there's radar data and other EM spectrum data on those. But they've got to release that data to the scientific community so that it can be analyzed. That's the only way you move forward, I think.
Look, one comment that I want to make, and that is that we keep hearing about the fact that we need data. That's a, you know, typically if I'm correct, that the way that you approach science is you have an observation, you start off with that, and then you come up with some sort of a hypothesis and you try to go after that hypothesis. And if you need data, you build a machine, you do something to make the data available to you to help prove your case, right? And so, I mean, it seems like it's a chicken and egg thing. I mean, don't we need scientists to be able to help come up with the equipment and the data to help us to get the data, to have data to then study, and so that's why we've needed all this time, the scientific people getting on board with this. And let me tell you something. I got started in a science class in 8th grade, okay, and that's how I got into this whole crazy subject. But I mean, and to me, that created a compelling interest to be able to go after it. And it doesn't take much in terms of if you really read good documents and good papers and good books and things like that are written, it doesn't take much to realize that there's something to this phenomena that goes beyond any explanation, regardless of what the government says or what anybody else tells you. In other words, you know, the data is, I mean, the information about this being a serious subject, you can go look at the FOIA requests and see that the Air Force treated it and were very concerned about it for a very, very long time. It doesn't take rocket science, but we can't get a lot of people, you know, to engage and really study it to then form an opinion on it. I mean, they just seem to like ignore it. We're just going to dismiss it because somebody told me that this is all nonsense. And we've got to get past that with this phenomenon. Hopefully the announcements that are coming out right now are going to help to influence some of that. The fact that we're growing in SCU and we've got people like Dr. Kevin Knuth and Dr. Szydagis and even Dr. Silvano Colombano, who are, you know, all these people that are engaging it now. We needed to get past that stigma and change that. Do you see that there's changes going on in academia? Do you see a little bit more openness? Can you talk about it? Are we making any progress? Anybody?
Can I chime in a second? I work in NASA 40 years, and I can really say that NASA has been able to jump on board from people. They were told by the Congress that they couldn't do it. So the real problem for us has been Congress that has made it impossible for NASA to be involved, for instance. And I have a story to tell around that in my own paper and so forth. But it's really Congress has been the problem until now. Perhaps they went up and became interested to jump in.
Thanks, Dr. Colombano. By the way, you're breaking up on your voice. Just want to let you know that you'll need to work on that. Anybody else have a comment before we move on? Hal, what are your thoughts about that? You've been at this for a long time. What have you seen in terms of are we improving at all? Do you think that there's any improvement down the road or what?
Well, I think just the lessening of stigma is the first step toward improvements coming. I wondered, you mentioned the SCU publications, 3 terrific publications on the Puerto Rico case and the Tic Tac and Stephenville and so on. Did they get published in any kind of peer-reviewed science journal? And if not, I mean, really, anything that could be done to press ahead with that, because if people start seeing stuff come out in official peer-reviewed academic journals, that's they're more likely to take a chance at doing something and submitting it in such places. Did any of them get published?
Not in any scientific journals that I'm aware, except Dr. Knuth, you got one of those papers in one, right? Correct? Can you speak up on that?
Yeah, we published our paper on the estimates of accelerations and velocities, so that's been published.
Yeah.
I wanted to add to that, actually, Kevin. I was not on a co-author on the paper with Kevin, but I was going to mention Kevin's paper which was with Peter and Robert. I wanted to say that now a lot of debunkers look like fools because the New York Times had the phrase high accelerations in there, and that ties in with the article that Kevin just said is a peer-reviewed journal. So much for Mick West and Adam Frank, because it's like, oh, really? You guys know better than the government who's claiming that it's unknown, really? So I think that slowly things are going to change. I wanted to address the question, though, if I can right now, about replicability. This keeps coming up in the chat, not in the official Q&A, because I think some people are using official Q&A and then the chat. I wanted to say that just because something is not reproducible doesn't mean you can't study it. Here's a case in point. Cosmology. We have only one universe. We have only one cosmic microwave background, and yet somehow we were able to pull out the age of the universe, 13.8 billion years, size and shape, with no reproducibility. You can't make miniature Big Bangs in the lab. We have computer simulations. But astronomy, astrophysics, and cosmology inherently, in some aspects, is not the same as other sciences where you build something on the tabletop. Observational science is a little bit different from experimental, empirical. It only makes it harder. It doesn't make it impossible. The lack of reproducibility doesn't make it not a science. It just makes it harder.
I think a good historical example of that was meteorites. About 200, maybe 300 years ago, science, which did exist, believed that rocks didn't fall from the sky, that those kind of things didn't happen. But it was the French scientists who, working diligently, collecting samples and they started doing some chemical analysis and realized that these things were not from the local geology and a lot of things like that. Slowly it got accepted. You can't predict an asteroid, or at least you shouldn't then, you couldn't anyhow. And, I couldn't predict a meteorite. And yet it's a science. It came through, and there's many things like that, So that's not a, that's not a valid, theory.
And a more recent example is the example of earthquake lights, which had been studied by Dr. Friedemann Freund at NASA Ames for decades, maybe. I met him back in 2003. We had a poster session, and my poster was next to his, and I got to learn about earthquake lights from him. And then I kind of asked around, some of the other guys at NASA, and said, what is this earthquake light business? And and of course, most people believe that earthquake lights were hallucinations because, and of course, you could make that very believable because it's like, well, you're in the middle of an earthquake, so they're already panicked, and then they see lights, and that's not surprising. And so it was easy to blow off earthquake lights. But they'd been seen for centuries. And Friedemann Freund was convinced that stresses in the rock, in the Earth's crust, were, through the piezoelectric effect, were creating high electric fields that were basically ionizing the air above the ground. And to me, that seemed reasonable. But he was never able to get into the AGU meeting, the American Geophysical Union meeting. He tried year after year and was just ignored and kept getting rejected. And it was a big problem. And he got some internal funding from NASA that year, which is why he had a poster session next to me. I was doing work on planetary nebula at the time. And it wasn't until just a few years ago, you can Google this now, and there was I think there were 2 earthquakes pretty much back to back, one in Chile and one in Japan, if I remember right, where security cameras caught images of earthquake lights, and they were also picked up by satellite. So you had again, multiple observations from multiple different sources were able to, convince people, wait a minute, yeah, this is actually a real thing. And I was pleased to see he's still alive, which is great. And so he was able to, he was immediately the world's expert on earthquake lights because he was one of the only people who ever studied it, which was really nice that he finally had that recognition. So that's a good example. But with all, so that's an example of a rare event where you have to happen to catch it to study it. So it's very similar to the UFO problem. And so it isn't, I don't think it's a matter of waiting around for the government to release data. Their data has not been collected scientifically. Their data is collected on the fly when they're doing other things, which is not very controlled. You're not getting all of the data. We know in some places that data gets modified, metadata data gets erased. So the data you get from the government or military really isn't scientific data, and that's a problem that we really haven't addressed yet just because we're desperate for data, right? And I think it's important that we do what needs to be done, which is basically collect our own data. And how do you do this? Well, we know how to do this. Witnesses see these things. So we have to go witness them ourselves. We have to set up observing stations. And I think Chris Cogswell is going to talk later about SkyHub and UAP DAP systems. And so that's a good start. And we're doing this with military grade FLIR cameras at this point with in UAPX. And we've had some success, which is really, really encouraging. And so I think it's important that, one of the things we do is start collecting our own information. And the other benefit with that is something that some of us are really familiar with. You don't have to vet any of it. You don't have to vet the images and make sure that, you collected them. You can record how you collect them, and then you can analyze them. And I think that's probably the most efficient way for us to proceed. And once you can show that any of us can go out and collect data on UAPs, then you can't stop the study of these things. I mean, you'll get people running out to collect, you get scientists running out to collect data all over the place. And so I think that would be a great benefit.
May I thank SCU for supporting and cooperating with UFO DAP and SkyHub, because third-party objective observational evidence is all those 2 entities.
Yeah, they can lay it right there.
They're not doing interpretation. And I wanted to thank you for doing that. But like all things, we need scientists.
That's clever what you did, Berta.
And
getting this little table.
Be supported with funding. We've got to get past that number.
Thank you, Bob McGuire. So, folks, this is concluding the panel session. Any last comments from each of the panel members before we close out here? Hal, would you like to say something?
Well, I think whatever news comes out, whether it's New York Times or you name it, we should just fill our outgoing emails with whatever data, just to show that stigma has been reduced and news is coming out. So I think that's probably the most effective thing we can do at this particular point.
Thank you. And thanks for your participation in the panel. Dr. Knuth, what would you like to say?
I think I would second that. The more vocal the scientists are about studying this, and especially when any of us make some kind of progress, I think is going to only help. and that's important.
Robert?
So thank you.
One thing I'll say, and I'm not taking away anything anyone else has said, but as you study and you want to get data, we also have to take into account that if what we're studying is something vastly more intelligent than us, this is also a little bit of like the mouse trying to gather data to collect on the professor who is experimenting on it.
Good point. Matthew, how about you? What would you like to say?
I think my final thought would be, I kind of have a concern, and I know Kevin shares this and others, that if we're really starting to see evidence slowly, truly of some sort of non-human intelligence, it could be the biggest "see, I told you so" in human history. And you have to apologize to your conspiracy theory friend who was right all this time. And I worry that it's going to damage the credibility of science as an endeavor. No one's going to take a vaccine again. No one's going to believe in the climate scientists and climate change, because they're going to say, well, you've been lying for 50 years about aliens. I have a serious concern about the damage that's going to be done by decades of skepticism, over skepticism. You have to be skeptical as a scientist, but I'm worried about the decades of over skepticism and debunking. And it's going to be bad if it turns out they were all wrong, some sincerely wrong, and maybe others actively lying, misinformation, disinformation. And I worry about the damage that's going to create, because then people are going to take the wrong message away and think the scientific method doesn't work. It does. And that's my big concern.
Thank you, Matt. How about you, Peter? What would you like to say?
Wow, it's a big variety of opinions, and I think I can't really add much to all of that. So I think I'll let that go.
All right. Well, again, I want to thank everybody on the panel and I appreciate it. I think it's been a great panel. I think we tackled a lot of very interesting topics, and I want to thank you for all your efforts and your time, and we'll be seeing you very shortly for presentations, many of you. So
watch more podcast clips now on our YouTube channel. Go to Livewire Podcast Clips and watch more great podcast videos just like this one.